It was October 12, 1968, and Johnny Cash was sitting alone in a holding cell at a small-town police station somewhere in Tennessee, exhausted down to his bones, staring at the floor, and facing charges that had the very real potential to tear apart everything he had spent his entire adult life building. He had been allowed one phone call, he had used it to reach his manager, and now all he could do was wait and hope that somehow this situation would not become the thing that finally broke him. What he had absolutely no idea about was that within the next 2 hours, the telephone at the front desk of that station was going to ring, and the person on the other end of the line was going to be Elvis Presley. To fully understand what that night meant and why it mattered so much, you have to understand where both of these men were in their lives at that particular point in time. The year 1968 was one of enormous change for Elvis. He had just wrapped up filming his landmark comeback television special, which was set to air in December and would go on to remind the entire world exactly why he had become such a massive and enduring presence in American music. But the years between his return from army service and that comeback had been genuinely difficult for him, filled with a long string of movie roles that felt hollow and a creeping sense that he had drifted away from the music and the identity that had made him who he was. Johnny Cash, meanwhile, was in an even harder place. His marriage was in serious trouble. He had been taking prescription medication for a long time just to keep up with a touring and recording schedule that would have pushed anyone past their limits, and the personal cost of all of it was becoming impossible to ignore or manage. He was still making music and still performing, but it was becoming clear to anyone paying close attention that something had to give. The two men had roots that went all the way back to the very beginning, back to when they were both young and hungry musicians recording at Sun Records in Memphis, sharing stages and swapping stories and navigating the completely disorienting experience of becoming famous before they were old enough to really understand what that was going to demand of them. On the specific evening of his arrest, Johnny had been driving through a small Tennessee town after wrapping up a recording session in Nashville. He had been on the road for weeks without proper rest, he had not slept decently in days, and the prescription medication he was taking to help him function through the exhaustion was making him foggy and disconnected from what was happening around him. When a police officer pulled him over for erratic driving, the officer found pills in Johnny's possession. They were not illegal drugs, they were legitimately prescribed medication, but Johnny did not have the documentation on him at that moment to prove it, and the two young officers who stopped him saw an opportunity. They arrested him, brought him in, and Johnny found himself sitting in a holding cell at a quiet small-town station on a Saturday night with just a few officers on duty, feeling the full weight of where his life had ended up pressing down on him from every direction. This was not the first time he had been in a situation like this, but something about this particular night felt heavier and more serious than the others, like he was standing at a fork in the road and the wrong step from here could cost him absolutely everything he had. He had reached his manager by phone, but the man was hours away and could not do anything immediately. So Johnny sat and waited. Then, about 2 hours after he was brought in, the front desk phone rang. The desk sergeant picked it up with his usual flat greeting, but something shifted in his posture almost immediately. He sat up straighter in his chair. His voice changed. He said, "Yes, sir," and then asked who was calling, and whatever name he heard in response made his eyes go wide. He looked over toward the holding area where Johnny was sitting, then back at the phone, and then said clearly enough for Johnny to hear through the fog of his exhaustion, "Yes, Mr. Presley. I'll let him know you're coming." Johnny heard that name and it cut right through the haze. Elvis. Elvis Presley was coming. What Johnny did not know was that Elvis had actually been at the same Nashville recording session earlier that day, though the two of them had not crossed paths while they were there. When word reached Elvis through the music industry network that Johnny had been arrested, he did not stop to think about it for long. He got in his car and started driving, and he called ahead to the police station to let them know he was on his way and to find out exactly what charges Johnny was facing. The wait for Johnny inside that cell felt endless. Part of him felt a deep shame at the idea of Elvis seeing him like this. Another part of him felt something closer to desperate hope. About 45 minutes after that phone call, Elvis walked through the front door of that police station, and the entire atmosphere of the place changed the moment he stepped inside. He was dressed simply, just jeans and a jacket, nothing flashy, but there was no question about who he was. The officers on duty straightened up and became noticeably more alert. But Elvis had not come there to be recognized or to charm anyone. He had come there for one single reason, which was to get Johnny Cash released. He walked directly to the front desk and spoke to the sergeant in a voice that was calm and measured but carried real authority. He said he was there for Johnny Cash and asked what the charges were. The sergeant laid them out: possession of prescription medication without documentation to prove it was legally prescribed, erratic driving, and the possibility of being impaired while behind the wheel of a vehicle. Elvis asked whether Johnny had been given a proper chance to prove the medication was legitimately prescribed to him. The sergeant admitted that had not happened yet. Elvis said in that case that was exactly where they should start, and he laid out the situation plainly. He said Johnny had been touring without a real break for months, that he was completely run down from the pace of it, and that the pills found on him had been prescribed by a physician to help him manage a schedule that would have ground most people into dust. He said if they contacted Johnny's doctor the facts would be confirmed. The younger officer who had made the arrest, who had been confident and almost proud of himself when he brought Johnny in, was looking considerably less sure of himself now. The sergeant acknowledged that even so, there was still the matter of the erratic driving and the fact that Johnny could have caused an accident or hurt someone. Elvis responded directly to that too. He said Johnny had not hurt anyone, had not caused any kind of accident, and had been stopped before anything dangerous actually happened. He said that told him this was a man who needed real support and help, not legal punishment, and that this was a man who had been pushed well past what any person could reasonably handle by an industry that takes everything performers have and never stops to ask what it is costing them. Then Elvis paused, and when he spoke again his voice dropped a little but became more focused and direct. He said he knew exactly what that felt like. The thing that would cost him everything he had worked for. Elvis said that if Johnny did not stop, he would lose himself, and that was a worse outcome than losing everything else. He said he had been through something comparable, that the specific details were different but the feeling of being stuck on a track he could not get off of was something he recognized completely. He said what he had eventually understood was that he had to decide what actually mattered more to him, the career or his actual life, because if the career consumed the life, there would eventually be nothing left of either one. Johnny sat with that for a while and then asked what had changed things for Elvis. Elvis told him that he had gone back to the reason he had started making music in the first place, not for the recognition or the money or the films, but because music had genuinely meant something to him at the beginning, because it had connected him to something that felt real and true. He said he had realized that if he could not find his way back to that original feeling, then everything else he was doing was just empty noise. Johnny asked if that was what the upcoming comeback special was really about. Elvis said yes, that it was about remembering who he actually was underneath everything that had been piled on top of him over the years, about being honest and real again even if that meant admitting openly that he had lost his direction for a while. The two of them sat in that rest stop parking lot for another full hour after that, talking about music and about the price that fame extracts from the people who carry it, two men who had started out together in the same Memphis recording studio as young and ambitious musicians and had ended up somewhere they had never quite planned for or been prepared to handle. When Elvis finally drove Johnny the rest of the way home and dropped him off, he said one more thing before Johnny got out of the car. He repeated what he had said before, that this night did not define Johnny Cash, but that what Johnny chose to do next would. He said Johnny had a real decision in front of him about the kind of life he wanted and the kind of person he wanted to be, and that whatever he decided, Elvis was there. He told him to call anytime he needed someone to talk to, someone to lean on, or just someone who genuinely understood what he was carrying. Johnny's voice was rough with emotion when he finally said thank you, for that night and for all of it. Elvis told him simply that this was what friends did. The legal charges from that night were eventually dropped completely. With proper documentation of Johnny's prescription and a set of character references that Elvis helped put together, the prosecutor concluded there was no case worth pursuing. But the outcome that truly mattered had nothing to do with what happened in a courtroom. For Johnny Cash, that night in that small Tennessee police station and the long honest conversation that followed it in the parking lot of a roadside rest stop became a genuine turning point in his life. It was not an overnight transformation, because those rarely are, but it was the beginning of one. Over the months and years that followed, Johnny did the hard and uncomfortable work of getting his life onto steadier ground, of facing the things he had been pushing aside for too long, of finding his way back to what actually mattered to him. When Johnny was interviewed in later years about his struggles and the road he took toward recovery, he would occasionally mention that a friend had shown up for him at the moment he needed it most and reminded him that one bad night did not have to write the ending of his story. He was always careful with the details, but the people who were close to both men understood exactly what he was referring to and what that night had meant. Elvis, for his part, never brought it up publicly once. When people asked him about his friendship with Johnny Cash, he would talk about the early days at Sun Records, about the respect he had for Johnny's music and his artistry, but he never once mentioned the night he got in his car and drove to a small-town police station to stand up for a friend who was in a very dark place. What Elvis did that night went well beyond posting bail or making the right phone calls in the right order. He walked into that station and reminded the people in it, and more importantly reminded Johnny himself, that the man sitting in that cell was worth showing up for, that struggling did not make a person less valuable, and that having even one friend who genuinely believes in you when you have stopped believing in yourself can be the thing that makes all the difference between what might have been lost and what was ultimately saved.